He doesn't belong here. These 4 words sliced through the champagne-scented air of the Grand Innovation Gala. The organizer's voice carried just enough volume to be heard by those nearby, a deliberate public dismissal. Dr. James Whitfield, 73, clutched his worn leather invitation with trembling fingers, his decades-old suit suddenly feeling like a costume among the designer tuxedos and flowing gowns of Silicon Valley's elite. The crystal chandeliers cast harsh shadows across the ballroom as whispers rippled through the crowd. The annual Science and Technology Excellence Awards were supposed to celebrate innovation, yet here stood its gatekeepers, measuring worth by appearance rather than achievement. Dr. Whitfield's revolutionary algorithms, the very foundation of the technology being celebrated tonight, remained unacknowledged while younger, wealthier developers claimed the spotlight. His life's work, borrowed without credit, powered the devices in everyone's pockets. Near the champagne fountain, partially hidden by an ice sculpture of the event's logo, a figure in an impeccably tailored suit observed the scene with increasing intensity. Leonardo DiCaprio, invited as a celebrity guest due to his environmental advocacy, was no stranger to recognizing authentic passion. The actor's eyes narrowed as he watched the elderly scientist being escorted toward the service exit, the man's dignity being stripped away with each step. What would happen next would transform not just this evening, but how the entire industry acknowledged its forgotten pioneers. Dr. Whitfield's shoulders curved inward as the organizer, Maxwell Bennett, gripped his elbow with unnecessary force. The scientist's weathered face, lined with 73 years of curiosity, dedication, and recently disappointment, remained composed despite the humiliation burning in his chest. For 40 years, he had worked in modest university labs, developing the core algorithms that now powered the world's most revolutionary technology. Tonight was supposed to be different. His former student had promised recognition at last. "Sir, perhaps you misunderstood the nature of our gathering," Bennett whispered, his cologne overwhelming as he leaned closer. "This is an invitation-only celebration of today's innovators, not historical contributors." The emphasis on historical carried enough venom to make several nearby attendees turn away in discomfort. A young woman in a sequined dress covered her embarrassed smile with a flute of champagne. Around them, the ballroom of the Grand Innovation Center gleamed with opulence. Interactive holographic displays showcased the year's breakthrough technologies, all built upon foundations Dr. Whitfield had established decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. His name appeared nowhere in the elaborate presentations, yet his mathematical formulas scrolled across several screens, uncredited. The elderly scientist slipped a hand into his pocket, fingers brushing against the folded speech he'd prepared, foolishly believing tonight might bring long overdue acknowledgement. Maxwell Bennett's smile didn't reach his eyes as he continued guiding Dr. Whitfield toward the service exit. "Perhaps you could watch the live stream from home? The technical aspects might be of historical interest to you." Several tech executives chuckled, their amusement rippling through the crowd like a toxic wave. One man, CEO of a company worth billions built on Whitfield's pioneering work, raised his glass in a mock toast. "I have an invitation, Doctor," Whitfield stated quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He pulled the worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "From Thomas. Thomas Chen was my student. 20 years ago, he—" "Yes, Doctor?" "Chen mentioned someone from his university days might appear," Bennett interrupted, his voice louder now, ensuring others would hear. "But he's accepting the Visionary Award tonight. I'm sure you understand how inappropriate it would be to have distractions." The last word hung in the air like an accusation, the scientist's contribution reduced to an inconvenience. From across the room, Leonardo DiCaprio lowered his untouched champagne. Unlike the others preoccupied with their social performance, He recognized something in the elderly man's dignified posture, the same quiet determination he'd witnessed in countless environmental scientists fighting against powerful interests. The actor moved casually along the perimeter of the gathering, his celebrity status making his movements both visible and unquestioned as he navigated closer to the unfolding scene. Dr. Whitfield's gaze moved past Bennett to the central stage where Thomas Chen, once his most promising student, was rehearsing his acceptance speech with the confidence of someone who had never known failure. Chen's company had grown to a $70 billion valuation in just 5 years, all built upon the foundation of Whitfield's unpatented algorithms. When the invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, the old scientist had allowed himself to hope. Perhaps Thomas had finally decided to acknowledge his mentor's contribution. "The award ceremony begins in 20 minutes, Bennett continued, his patience visibly thinning. "We can't have unauthorized persons disrupting our schedule." 2 security personnel materialized beside them, their expressions professionally neutral, yet intimidating. A few phone cameras turned in their direction, sensing potential drama amidst the evening's carefully orchestrated celebrations. The first flash went off as Dr. Whitfield's invitation was plucked from his fingers for verification. His face, momentarily illuminated, revealed neither anger nor defeat, but something more compelling: the quiet dignity of a man who had devoted his life to advancement rather than acknowledgement. In that fleeting moment captured on dozens of devices, the contrast between his weathered integrity and the polished superficiality surrounding him became undeniable. Leonardo DiCaprio, now positioned near a towering display of Thomas Chen's company logo, felt a familiar resolve solidify within him, the same feeling that had driven him to champion environmental causes against seemingly insurmountable opposition. The truth, no matter how inconvenient, deserved to be heard. "Is there a problem here?" The question cut through the tension with unexpected clarity. Leonardo DiCaprio stepped forward, his celebrity presence creating an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Phone cameras swiveled, social media live streams found new focus, and Bennett's practiced smile faltered momentarily before reasserting itself with doubled intensity. "Mr. DiCaprio, an honor to have you with us tonight," the organizer gushed, hand still firmly guiding Dr. Whitfield toward the exit. "Just a minor confusion with an uninvited guest. Nothing to concern yourself with?" "I believe I heard this gentleman mention an invitation," DiCaprio countered, his voice carrying the same measured conviction that had addressed world leaders on climate issues. He extended his hand toward the elderly scientist. "I'm Leonardo." Dr. Whitfield's weathered hand met the actor's in a firm handshake. James Whitfield, former professor of computational mathematics at Berkeley. The simple introduction, delivered without embellishment, carried the weight of decades of unrecognized achievement. Bennett stepped between them with practiced smoothness. "Mr. DiCaprio, we're absolutely thrilled by your environmental advocacy. In fact, Thomas Chen's quantum computing applications for climate modeling, which he'll be discussing tonight, would make fascinating conversation for you both. Perhaps over dinner next week? Tonight's schedule is quite tight." The surrounding crowd had doubled in size, drawn by DiCaprio's unexpected intervention. Security personnel shifted uncomfortably, caught between Bennett's obvious desire to remove the elderly scientist and the celebrity's clear interest in him. Phone cameras recorded everything as the power dynamic visibly shifted. "Actually," DiCaprio said, glancing at the quantum computing display nearby, "I'm curious about these algorithms. They look remarkably similar to work I read about in an environmental science journal last year." He turned to Dr. Whitfield. "Weren't you published in Science Advances back in the 90s? Something about predictive modeling that was decades ahead of its time?" The elderly scientist's eyes widened slightly. "You've read my work?" When you care about something, you learn its history, DiCaprio replied, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Too many people focus only on the finished product, forgetting the shoulders they stand upon. His pointed gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Thomas Chen, who had paused his rehearsal upon noticing the commotion. Bennett's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Mr. DiCaprio, while we appreciate your interest in scientific history, tonight is about celebrating current innovation. Dr. Whitfield's contributions, while perhaps noteworthy in their time, are not the focus of current innovation built on uncredited foundations isn't innovation," DiCaprio interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention in boardrooms and at the United Nations. "It's appropriation." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Nearby conversations halted. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their company's blockbuster technologies incorporated principles developed in Dr. Whitfield's lab. A young programmer whispered to her colleague, her expression troubled as recognition dawned. Thomas Chen had abandoned his rehearsal entirely now, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. His hand gripped his acceptance speech so tightly the paper crumpled at the edges. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. The crowd had swelled to 3 times its original size, drawn by the unmistakable tension. DiCaprio placed a hand on Dr. Whitfield's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity captured by dozens of cameras. "Dr. Whitfield, would you mind explaining your work to me? I'm particularly interested in how your early algorithms predicted pattern recognition capabilities that weren't technologically possible until recently." The elderly scientist straightened slightly, his academic's instinct to teach momentarily overriding his discomfort. The mathematics wasn't complicated, really. It was about seeing patterns where others saw only noise. "My 1987 paper demonstrated that natural systems—" "This is hardly the venue for a technical lecture," Bennett interjected, panic bleeding through his polished veneer. His eyes darted to the event schedule projected discreetly on his tablet. The award ceremony would begin in 12 minutes, and this unexpected disruption threatened to derail the carefully orchestrated evening. "I disagree," DiCaprio countered. "What better venue to discuss the foundation of today's breakthroughs?" He gestured toward the massive displays showcasing Chen's company innovations, especially when that foundation remains uncredited. The murmurs grew louder. Someone from the press section had begun recording. A tech journalist recognized Dr. Whitfield's name and was rapidly typing notes on her phone. The story was evolving from a minor disruption to something potentially explosive. Thomas Chen finally descended from the stage, moving with deliberate calm toward the growing congregation. His expression was carefully composed, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. As founder and CEO of Quantum Nexus, the night's most celebrated company, his intervention would either defuse the situation or escalate it beyond control. The award ceremony countdown continued, 11 minutes remaining. Security personnel formed a loose perimeter awaiting Chen's signal. Dr. Whitfield watched his former student approach with an expression that mixed disappointment with a flicker of hope that had refused to die after 2 decades of silence. Thomas Chen moved through the crowd with practiced confidence, his custom-made tuxedo a stark contrast to his former professor's worn suit. At 45, Chen embodied the modern tech titan, polished, powerful, and worth billions on paper. The room quieted as he approached, all eyes fixed on this unexpected confrontation between past and present. "Professor Whitfield," Chen acknowledged with a measured nod. "I didn't expect to see you actually come." The statement contained neither warmth nor hostility, merely observation. His gaze shifted to DiCaprio. "Mr. DiCaprio, I'm a great admirer of your environmental work, though I confess I'm surprised by your interest in computational algorithms." Truth interests me in all its forms, DiCaprio replied evenly. Dr. Whitfield was explaining how his early work formed the foundation for pattern recognition systems that power today's AI, including, it seems, your quantum computing applications. A tense silence descended. Around them, hundreds of industry leaders, investors, and media personalities watched the drama unfold. Bennett hovered anxiously at the periphery, tablet displaying the countdown. 8 minutes until the ceremony. Security personnel positioned themselves strategically, uncertain how to proceed. Chen's smile remained fixed, but something shifted in his eyes. Professor Whitfield's theoretical work was certainly inspirational, as were many academic papers of that era. His dismissive tone carried a clear message. Theoretical work and actual innovation were worlds apart. Inspirational? Dr. Whitfield spoke for the first time since Chen's arrival, his voice quiet but unwavering. Thomas, equation 17 in your quantum processor patent is identical to the algorithm I developed in 1992, the one you helped code as my graduate student. The elderly scientist wasn't accusatory, merely factual, which somehow made the statement more damning. Chen's composure wavered momentarily before he recovered. Professor, with all due respect, theoretical equations in an academic paper hardly compare to the complex engineering required to implement them in real-world applications. My team spent years transforming abstract concepts into functional technology. Your foundational patent contains the exact mathematical notation I developed, Dr. Whitfield persisted, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Even the variable names are identical, Thomas? The crowd's murmuring intensified. A tech journalist edged closer, recording discreetly. DiCaprio stood silently beside the elderly scientist, his presence amplifying the confrontation beyond a simple dispute into something that demanded resolution. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate, Bennett began, but Chen silenced him with a slight gesture. The academic world and industry have always had different standards, Chen stated, addressing the crowd as much as Whitfield. Universities publish theories, businesses build solutions that actually help people. The gap between them is where true innovation happens. Innovation requires acknowledgement of its origins, DiCaprio interjected, his voice carrying unexpected authority on the subject. I've worked with scientists my entire career who understood that progress is built on honoring those who came before, not erasing them. The room had grown completely silent. The countdown showed 5 minutes remaining. Chen glanced toward the stage where his award waited, then back at his former professor and the Hollywood star standing beside him. Whatever calculations ran behind his eyes, they clearly indicated that this situation couldn't be simply dismissed or escorted away. Your invitation tonight was meant as a courtesy, Professor, Chen finally said, his voice hardening, not as an opportunity to disrupt an industry celebration with decades-old grievances about academic credit. Dr. Whitfield's eyes reflected not anger, but a profound disappointment. Is that what you think this is about, Thomas? Credit? The question hung in the air, heavier than accusation. Leonardo DiCaprio stepped forward, the full weight of his public persona behind his words. This isn't about credit, Mr. Chen. It's about integrity, about acknowledging that breakthroughs aren't miracles that appear from nowhere. They're built on decades of work by people who often remain invisible. The actor turned to address the room, his voice resonating with the same passion that had characterized his Oscar acceptance speech. I came tonight as a guest, interested in how technology might help our environmental challenges. But what I'm witnessing is exactly the problem I've seen in climate science, the voices that laid the groundwork being systematically silenced. Several phones live-streamed his impromptu speech. Behind them, Bennett frantically consulted with event staff, the ceremony now just 3 minutes from its scheduled start. Chen's expression hardened. With respect, Mr. DiCaprio, You understand films, not technology development. Professor Whitfield published theoretical work within the safety of academia. I risked everything, my capital, my reputation, to bring these concepts into reality. My theoretical work, Dr. Whitfield said quietly, was completed in a basement lab I built myself after the university cut my funding. I remortgaged my home twice to continue when grants dried up. I worked nights as a security guard to pay for computational time. Each simple statement landed with devastating precision. I never sought wealth, Thomas, only to advance human knowledge. A hush fell over the crowd. The contrast between the elderly scientist in his worn suit and the billionaire in bespoke finery crystallized into something powerfully symbolic. Someone in the back began to applaud, slowly at first, then joined by others. Chen stood frozen, the narrative slipping beyond his control as phones captured everything. The ceremony countdown showed 1 minute remaining. Whatever happened next would define not just the evening, but how history would remember Thomas Chen's rise to prominence. The choice between truth and carefully constructed legacy hung in the balance. Thomas Chen stood motionless as the applause grew, watching something intangible yet essential slipping through his fingers. His gaze moved from his former professor to the award waiting on stage, and finally to the hundreds of industry leaders watching this unscripted moment of truth. The ceremony start time had passed. The carefully orchestrated evening was now operating on borrowed time. 30 years ago, Chen began, his voice cutting through the applause, I was a struggling immigrant student with nothing but determination. He paused, visibly wrestling with himself before continuing, and a professor who saw potential in me when no one else did. The room grew silent again, sensing a shift in the narrative. DiCaprio remained beside Dr. Whitfield, whose weathered face revealed nothing. The quantum nexus processing architecture, Chen continued with careful precision, is built upon fundamental mathematical frameworks developed by Dr. James Whitfield in the early 1990s. The admission, once spoken, seemed to physically transform him, not diminishing his stature, but somehow making him more human. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Bennett stared in disbelief from the side of the stage, his carefully planned event veering into uncharted territory. Innovation isn't a solitary act, Chen continued, his voice growing stronger. It's a continuum that spans generations. Tonight, before accepting any award, I need to correct an omission that has persisted too long. He turned to face Dr. Whitfield directly. Professor, I owe you more than acknowledgement. I owe you a place at this table. Chen gestured toward the stage. Would you join me, Professor Whitfield? The invitation, delivered with newfound humility, hung in the air between them, an offering of reconciliation. The elderly scientist studied his former student, decades of disappointment weighing against this moment of public acknowledgement. Why now, Thomas? He asked quietly, a question meant for Chen alone, though the surrounding silence carried it further. Because truth matters more than narrative, Chen replied, echoing DiCaprio's earlier sentiment, something I lost sight of along the way. Leonardo DiCaprio stepped back, allowing mentor and protege their moment. His unexpected intervention had catalyzed something profound, yet the resolution belonged to the two men whose lives had been intertwined through mathematics and innovation. The actor nodded slightly to Dr. Whitfield, a gesture of respect between two individuals who understood standing firm for principles. Social media exploded as the evening's unexpected drama reached millions. Truth in Tech began trending within minutes. Technology journalists frantically revised their prepared stories about the award ceremony, focusing instead on this unprecedented moment of public accountability. Bennett, recognizing the shifting winds, quickly consulted with his team before approaching the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to announce a special presentation tonight, he announced, professional smile firmly back in place. Dr. James Whitfield, pioneering mathematician whose work forms the foundation of modern pattern recognition algorithms, will be joining Thomas Chen for the Visionary Award presentation. The crowd's response was immediate and enthusiastic, not the polite applause of industry functions, but something authentic that acknowledged the righting of a long-standing wrong. Chen extended his hand to his former professor, who after a moment's hesitation accepted it. 6 months later, Dr. James Whitfield stood at a university podium, addressing a packed auditorium of young computer science students. The James Whitfield Innovation Scholarship, newly established by Quantum Nexus with a $50 million endowment, had just announced its first 20 recipients. Innovation isn't owned by corporations or individuals, the elderly scientist told the rapt audience. It belongs to humanity. Your responsibility isn't just to build something new, but to honor the foundations you build upon. In the back of the auditorium, Leonardo DiCaprio listened quietly. His unexpected role in that pivotal evening had sparked something more significant than a viral moment. It had triggered an industry-wide reckoning about crediting scientific foundations. The number Truth in Tech movement had led to multiple companies establishing recognition programs for the academic pioneers whose work underpinned their billion-dollar products. After the ceremony, DiCaprio approached Dr. Whitfield. Your algorithms are now helping track climate patterns in our foundation's conservation work, he shared. Sometimes the right equations can change the world in ways their creator never imagined. The elderly scientist smiled. That night changed more than my recognition, you know. It changed Thomas, too. He nodded toward Chen, who was chatting with scholarship recipients nearby. He's mentoring students again, something he hadn't done since founding his company. Some moments define us, DiCaprio replied. When given the choice between protecting a narrative and embracing the truth, he ultimately made the right choice. Dr. Whitfield's eyes crinkled with gentle wisdom. Truth has a way of finding its moment. Sometimes it just needs a catalyst. He extended his hand to the actor. Thank you for being that catalyst. As they shook hands, phones captured the moment, but this time there was nothing to expose. Only a genuine connection between people who understood that true legacy isn't measured in awards or wealth, but in the courage to acknowledge that no innovation exists in isolation and no progress happens without honoring its roots.